Chinese stuff, primarily Chinese stuff, through another country. Unbeknownst to you, and you as the importer really honestly didn't know that, but you are the importer of record and you're going to pay that duty.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, folks, we are going forward here with another show. This one's going to be a really cool show. Lalo, I'll tell you, this is one of our new shows, and I am looking forward to this. We have introduced a whole quadri of shows, I guess, with our annual week. And with that, this is one that I'm going to let you introduce it since it was originally your idea on this. But folks, you're going to love this. This is one of our guests that we got a tremendous amount of positive feedback on a previous show. But Lalo, why don't you talk about what we're going to hear today?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, happy Halloween, everyone. And just fitting, this show fits perfectly, or this format fits perfectly for Halloween. It's going to scare the heck out of you. And not necessarily with, not necessarily Jason or Freddy type scare, but fines and penalties scare, probably. That's the one that'll. And so we approached Larry Hanson. Everybody knows him because he's always at all the conferences. We were just talking about
around
that
since dirt.
Yep. And so we approached him and said, "Hey, what do you think about a Halloween episode?" And he quickly jumped on it and said, "Of course." And so this one's going to be really good. A lot of the maybe names or locations have been changed to protect the innocent. But anyway, yeah. So, but everything else is factual. Everything is very factual, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned out of this. So let's just go ahead and bring them in, Andy. So Larry, we'll have Larry Hanson come in, and
Larry Hanson, welcome. This is airing here on Halloween, as we just said, and we are. This is our Simply Trade Crimes edition. So, Larry, first off, welcome to our show again, and. Appreciate it. And secondly, you've got a good story for us, I think, is what we've talked off camera here. So why don't you start us off with this? This is going to be one, folks, that you're going to want to listen to, and this will be a good one.
Yeah, good to see you guys again. Particularly honored to be on the Halloween show. I'm not sure what that means. My go-to Halloween costume is always the Invisible Man. I avoid Halloween parties and tell people I went as the Invisible Man. And they applaud how effective my costume was. But lawyers have a lot of stories that are scary, and there's true fear there. None of us dress up as Freddy Krueger or anything else here, but they do have cases. Every lawyer has cases where there is a definite fear of what's going to happen to your importing client. In this case, it was an importing client that was there. So this story began quite a few years ago, and as Lalo said, I had to change the name of the people and any other identifying information here. The quotes from the government, the positions that were taken, these are all absolutely factual, including quotes. But it's a different country and a different source and a different product and different people. So not so much the guilty, but just to save the embarrassment of the people here or there. So being Halloween, I have to start off with very simply, I'd like to start off and say it was a dark and stormy night. But it wasn't really. It was even scarier than a dark and stormy night. It began with the search warrant. There are a few things that are scarier in law enforcement when the government shows up, and usually small vans or Ford LTDs, and they have guns drawn. In Texas, they will wear cowboy hats because they want to live the stereotype. And it is a day that you'll remember. It is a scary experience, truly. Nothing you can really possibly recreate it. It is pretty much the opposite of trick and treat, where you might have good choices. There's no good choices here.
Hey, folks, we've got a listener show coming up, and we need you to be on our panel.
We're actually going to make this our year-end, or one of our year-end wrap-up shows, and we really, really would like to hear from you.
Please let us know via LinkedIn and express your interest in that, and we're going to reach out to you so that we can get you on our show.
November 10th at 11 a.m. Central. We'd like to have you on our show.
So this case began there. And it's important to know about a search warrant. A search warrant is never the beginning of the story. That is almost always the middle of the story. The government has already been looking at you for some time. They have already convened people together to talk about you, to investigate you, to gather evidence here. They had to go to a federal judge or a magistrate and convince them that a crime had been committed. And this is not something that requires merely a CF-28 to get the information. They want to go and seize it. And so that's where my story begins here. It began with a search warrant. Having begun my career as an attorney in customs, I can tell you the literally weeks, if not months, of work that went behind the scenes before that point. So there's a lot of things that happen here. We'll begin with that, though, and I'll tell you that it was a simultaneous nationwide search warrant. They executed a search warrant in a famous Rust Belt city in the north and a famous southern city in the south, simultaneously to the minute, to make sure people couldn't call each other and destroy evidence or anything else here. So you had not only a search warrant, but you had a cooperation literally across the country to make sure that they could coordinate this in a way that was most effective for law enforcement. And it was very effective. So they raided two different places. They had a search warrant. And that began the process here. The allegations that were raised in the warrant, that there was evidence of anti-dumping and countervailing duty circumvention. This was an AD-CVD criminal case. They wanted to put them in jail for 5 years for every single AD-CVD violation, and they had 97 entries. So we're talking 485 years in prison should we not succeed on this. So it was certainly a very heady point there. There are times in a search warrant where I have been called literally in the middle of the search warrant. They call me from the office and say, there's a guy here with a gun and a piece of paper. And all I can say is, if it's signed and it's got the right address on it, there's nothing you can do. There's no magical legal statement you can make here that gets rid of that person right there. And you want to cooperate. And most good agents are willing. They want to cooperate. They know what they're there for, and they're right to be there. They have done everything by the book to get to that point. The rare cases where they they go to the wrong address. That does happen pretty rarely. In all fairness to law enforcement, it does not happen very often. They took a lot of precautions to make sure that kind of thing does not happen here. So you can picture it just like it is on TV. Literally, at two different locations around the country, they pull up in vans and they start taking things like your computers, your laptops, your cell phones, your physical files here. They can interrogate people, but you don't have to talk to them. And so that will last pretty much the entire day. And there's procedures they have to follow during doing that, and lawyers can pick that apart if they do something wrong during the search warrant. But overall, they know what they're doing on the search warrant. I've never really had a case where they did the search warrant in an invalid manner. They really do get it right most of the time here. So this case, like any other case, we were hired just after the search warrant. Usually it's the next day. In this case, it was within a day or two. They were looking for an attorney, and they eventually settled on us. And we now are going to meet the client for the first by telephone here. And this conversation always begins exactly the same way. I can't believe this is happening to me. They're picking on me every single time. They're picking on me. Maybe it's because I voted this way in the last election. I'm like, No, my experience tells me they have something on you. We got to figure out what that is. And so that begins a question. And sometimes the clients are very evasive. They don't want to admit that they have gotten caught on something. So they're very evasive. You ask them, what do you think this is about? I have no idea. It's a flat out lie to them. Have an idea what it might be. So they begin to ask questions like that. So questions I would ask in this case is, again, this is a couple of days after the search warrant. Well, what do you import? Do you import or export anything? If you don't import or export, that's an unusual circumstance. I can't say it can't happen, but overall, you're importing or exporting. We'll start with that. What do you import? Well, we import a certain specialty metal. I'll call it a CSM, a certain specialty metal from a country I'm going to call Malaysia land. To not pick on any Asian country, but I'll tell you, it was not China. And that was important because that was the allegation that this was really Chinese stuff that was being transshipped through Malaysia land and being brought to the United States. So, and every lawyer who watches AD/CVD cases, because I have no life and I look at AD/CVD cases, we know that this certain specialty metal was in fact subject to anti-dumping from China. And so that's always a clue. If you're bringing in the exact same product from another country, there's a possibility, whether to your knowledge or not, that it's been transshipped. Sometimes it's transshipped with your knowledge. You're part of the scheme. But in all fairness, a lot of times it's not. Some guy in Malaysia land, South Korea, Philippines, or Russia, any place. I've had them all over the world. They transship Chinese stuff, primarily Chinese stuff, through another country. Unbeknownst to you, and you as the importer really honestly didn't know that, but you are the importer of record and you're going to pay that duty. This case was a little different, and if you just did not pay the duty, you're going to get a C of 28, you're going to get a C of 29, and a large bill. And a lot of letters from your surety who's going to be pretty upset with you too. But it's all money, and it's a collection thing. You don't get search warrants really for that. They thought this was an intentional act. And as the facts unfold
okay,
here.
So let's hang on a second. You are going down. It's like, man, there's a lot in this. And as I want to stop for a second, folks, as you're listening through this, you ought to be able to pick up on some things. What if this were you? Are you prepared right off the bat? If you are doing any kind of international importing and exporting, you better have a relationship with a customs attorney firm right off the bat, so that, in the event you have somebody you can go to, I would think that would be wise to already have that in place, that relationship, so you're not going and wasting time on, like you just said, Larry, you were having to do kind of like an investigator. It's like, okay, let's go through the preliminary questions to see what's going on. You've already got that kind of stuff. But then the other thing is you're already looking at, if you're sourcing, you're purchasing, your sourcing group ought to be collaborating with your compliance group to say, well, if we're sourcing from here, what other countries import this product, and are there any risk at all? So your legal team should be looking at it as well to say, is there a risk involved, which would get into your customs folks as well. But anyway.
Well, that's a good point here. But the point here in this case, the clients who get search warrants typically don't have attorneys at all, and they've not given compliance any thought at all. This client is an example of that. They never really thought to get an attorney at all involved in that. It is unusual because if you have an attorney involved that can do that, and there's many out there who really know their things, you're able to avoid these things. And every attorney would agree. If you'd come to us, lawyers always have to say, if you'd come to us, 3 months or 1 year earlier, we could have asked all these questions and prevented this. Almost all things that happen like this can be prevented. I can't say 100%, but even like a guy overseas who's just lying, he really wants to break the law and leave you holding the bag. Even in those cases, there are things you can do to protect yourself. So prevention is always the key. By the time you get to the search warrant, we're no longer about prevention. We're looking at I wish we had done this.
Yeah. Well, and here's the other thing, Larry, you're hitting on something too, that they don't just, they see a situation. Let me rephrase it. I would say more than likely it's extremely rare that they see an importation like this or something and they immediately jump to a search warrant. There is going to be inquiries, like you said, a CF-28, a CF-29. There's going to be something going on. And at that point, Customs is asking for information, But you've got to, and you need to respond to it, but you also need to be looking beyond that to say, where are they going? What's prompting this? And hence the scenario 3-6 months down the road, or immediately after that is getting your resources involved. Obviously, they didn't do this. They thought they could continue on, either not respond to the inquiries or gave some kind of proverbial BS answer, whatever the case may be. And so here we are. So it's continuing on. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want people to understand this is entertaining in one respect on a story and what happened, but on the flip side of it, what's your takeaway here?
Yeah, more important than the story is the lesson, and you're entirely right. This is the last resort. The government does not go to a search warrant. They can't just go to a search warrant. They have to get a search warrant. They got to get a probable cause affidavit. They got to convince the U.S. attorney to take the case. They got to convince the magistrate to execute your search warrant. They got to have planning meetings and mock-up training of how they're going to handle the search warrant versus simply sending out a CF-28. And that is the go-to thing to do. Send out a CF-28, request for information, and they can get almost everything they need out of that, and go from there to get them revenue and things like that. There were facts here that led them to believe there was intentional criminal acts here. But it was after months of investigation before they got that fact here. So there we are. We are now meeting with the client for the first time, and we're asking questions like, what do you bring in? A certain specialty metal, and everyone knows that they're subject to, if it comes from China, it is subject to additional anti-dumping countervailing duties. Very, very common situation here, only accentuated because of the Trump tariffs, like 301, 232. Because people had even more reason to lie about the origin, or have the origin misrepresented by someone overseas here. So we see a lot of that, but it begins to focus the issues that are there. They said, absolutely, we did not sell things from China. And then we turn a little bit later, and literally in the same conversation, well, when I say we didn't buy from China, we only bought from China going into Canada, not the United States. I'm like, well, let's go over that for a second here, because originally you had nothing out of China. Now you have stuff out of China. You knew manufacturers of this metal in China. You had more facts here than we had here. But the story they stuck with, it was in Malaysia land. And they were describing, I asked them, well, how do you know it really came from Malaysia land? How do you know this? We did all these things. And in all fairness, to some extent, they did a measure of due diligence. They checked out the company. It was, in fact, a legitimate company in this fake country I'm naming here. It was reputed by the Chamber of Commerce here. They had banking contacts that were legit. There were overall some good things that were there. But then some of the evidence, I didn't notice at the time, not in the first phone call. First phone call, we had a pretty clear case where the government thought it was Chinese stuff, and the client said it's in Malaysia land. And so there's our dispute there. And if we can prove definitively it is actually made in Malaysia land, we're in good shape here. So we just began to gather evidence here, gather the facts here. Now, we talk to the client, we look at their documents, and a lot of the stuff says Malaysia land and everything else. That's all very good. One of the things every lawyer does after a search warrant is executed, you go and look at what they got. Literally, I traveled to a southern city and outside of Texas, and I got to go through the warehouse of material they had taken. And including all the emails, and it would take. I'm more than glad to print out for me because they were pretty damaging here. So I will give you a multiple choice of what things that we found about our client as I'm going through their files the government now has. This is the point of the story where you learn about your client. And it happens in every case because no client has ever really told you the complete truth, or at least colored it the same way. So things that may or may not have been in the materials the government now had in hand because they got it through the search warrant. Quote, whatever you do, put the product in made in Canada bags so we won't have to pay the U.S. duty, end quote. Right.
Oh, boy.
Sure, we visited the plant in Malaysia land, but it was closed that day. So they literally traveled, as it becomes a part of the story, they traveled to Malaysia land to look at the plant to make sure it was really made there, and literally traveled around the world to get there, and that day it was closed. They couldn't go inside. I saw a picture. They took a picture outside of the plant where they're making this metal. And I already knew that we're toast because the picture, very good picture, very clear picture, only had truck doors and no smokestacks.
I was just going to say, did you see any evidence of a actual factory there?
Exactly the opposite. I knew right then what had happened because this was obviously not a manufacturing plant of any sort. It was merely a transshipment plant, as it turned out to be true. Then you go to Plan B, and that's the idea of substantial transformation. And they were like, because if you took Chinese material, substantially transformed it in a manner that is now outside the scope of the anti-dumping order, or a different country of origin, which are not the same questions, then you're in luck. And so then the client asks, what is the substantial transformation thing? I'm like, okay, if you don't know that, you didn't ask that. So we're there. My favorite one, which I get out of Asia a lot, is we have a stamp. The documents are stamped, country of origin, Malaysia land. We got a stamp. Doesn't that solve the problem? And having been over to Asia too many times with people who just sell stamps on the street, they look very official, and they mean absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So this is now, it's always gets darker before the storm, just on any Halloween night, darker before the light. And it was dark here because there's evidence there that will need to be explained if nothing else here. It was pretty damaging, and the government thought they had 100% slam dunk case. But that's when the lawyers start getting to work. That's when we start thinking, okay, now what do we do? We got some bad facts here. We got to face our facts, and we got a passionate defense here. And so we had a number of defenses, pretty standard defense here. One, blame Malaysia land. Folks overseas lied. Our poor American client was victimized by the evil Halloween monster overseas and everything else. The only problem with that, of course, is that, well, you're the imported record, so it doesn't make any difference, but at least it colors the case a little bit. These people, my clients, got advice from people that was just simply wrong advice. It was a consultant type who did help them with the due diligence, and it was just comically insufficient. So blame the supplier and tell the government we can explain everything. So that's going to be our defense here. We didn't do it, but if we did, it's someone else's fault. And this should really be a civil penalty versus a criminal case.
Larry, and I guess the common denominator here is you're still the importer record, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. Everyone, I get all these cases have the common theme of I didn't do it, he did it. I'm like, you're in the block on the 7501. You're the importer record. That's pretty much all we got to do. It's it. You may have good excuses, and that may go to things like criminal intent. It's not an irrelevant consideration here, but the fact that you didn't know better doesn't make a difference. You're the importer record. You're going to owe that duty. Period. So we have that. There's our situation here. We now have a criminal case. The government has signaled that they want our clients to go to prison for up to, but not more than 485 years. And
no more than.
Oh my God!
No more than no more than 485. That's the law requires. Nothing less than that. And no client's going to pay. They're not going to do that or anything else here. But they signaled, and from the evidence you saw there was objectively speaking evidence that they knew what they were doing and did it anyway. Once you get to the point where the government thinks you knew what you were doing and chose the wrong path, that is a criminal case. That is evidence of criminal intent. That's why we have prisons. This is why we have these kind of laws here. And it happens, unfortunately, with some degree of regularity, I think, sometimes here. So our first meeting, and this is now probably a few months into the case. Now we've done our homework. We have seen all the evidence the government has. We have looked at evidence the government does not have. We've done our own investigation. We talked to our clients many, many times, including challenging them on some things that they were saying when they weren't telling us the truth. And so then we go to a meeting with, there's always a meeting. Very often, in this case, was the U.S. Attorney's Office. The federal prosecutor who is going to put these people on trial for their life. I am meeting with her at the small southern town. And this is an important meeting. If the meeting goes well, the AUSA is going to say to the government, they're bad, but they aren't that bad. And they don't have a great case, but they have a little bit of a case. I'd rather just not have a criminal case here. If at that meeting we can begin to plant the doubts in the criminal case, they really begin to think that, this is really more of a civil penalty, then we have done our job. a civil penalty, no one's going to jail. You're going to be assessed a large sum of money, which you're never going to pay anyway. That's still a victory if you can just stay out of jail. Generally speaking, clients want to stay out of jail. Go figure. So we will help them with that. So you got to picture this. We're in the U.S. Attorney's office, okay, and the federal prosecutor was very enthusiastic in her job. Homeland Security, well, then that time it was customs agents were there. They were very enthusiastic in their job. They thought they had a slam dunk case, and admittedly, they had a pretty strong case. And their only agreement was how long of a prison term, and they wanted at least decades, just decades in prison. Decades in prison was they weren't going for 485, but they would have been settled for 30 or 40, which is not acceptable either. And this would be federal time, no parole time. So it's a pretty severe thing. So I'm in the meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I'm going through it's Korea's fault. The jury's going to be sympathetic. You're going to lose this case. The jury's not going to like what happened to these poor Americans here. I'm going to wrap ourselves in the flag. You're going to just create some doubt that you have a case here or not. They were not buying it. To tell you the truth, they're like, see you in court. We think we got a good case, and they think they had a good case, so couldn't argue with them on that. But one particular point, which turned out to be a pivotal part in the case, I said, they traveled to the foreign country to demonstrate due diligence, reasonable care in these things here. And the U.S. attorney took the position that travel to a foreign country was evidence of a conspiracy that they could use against you in a criminal case in the U.S. I'm like, that was an interesting point, because my next words out of my mouth is I'm going to call the Commissioner of Customs and every single other person I can think of in Customs who will testify that is example of reasonable care. Customs seems to have an odds with the Department of Justice on this matter.
They want you to go check things out, and if you don't, you're not showing due diligence, or you're exercising due diligence to try and look to. So now the Justice Department is looking at it as, you're participating in planning it out and in the conspiracy.
I don't know that I would say now the DOJ would say that now, but in this particular case, that was a really big thing, and that was my one thing I had going for me. I was able to say, "I'll see you in court," because Customs will say this is not conspiracy. This is good due diligence here. That began a debate for about 2 or 3 months, where I swore I was going to call the Commissioner of Customs to talk about reasonable care really means, and that will be the trial here. How it's unclear what reasonable care is. You can't put someone in jail when even the government disagrees with each other on what is reasonable care or not. The end of that story, which is the very good news for the client, is the government dropped the criminal case. They dropped the criminal case, partly because they knew what we were going to do.
And that must have been from a standpoint that with all the supposed evidence in there, that they were counting at the trip overseas or wherever as a major issue of them participating in a crime. All right. So when that's gone, the rest of the evidence didn't stand up to make it criminal.
Well, it became doubtful. I mean, the U.S. Attorney's job, Customs' job is to collect the duty. They did their job here. They did it right. They did nothing wrong here at all. The Department of Justice, they have other angles here, other issues. They don't want to lose in court. They really don't want to lose, especially because justice could be served by a penalty. The penalties, as you guys both know, can be up to the full domestic value of all the shipments that are involved here. It will destroy you. So if the AUSA is somewhat reluctant to take the case, they have a very good out to go civil, which they eventually did in this case. And so that was a major victory. I told the client, you're not going to go to jail, but they're going to come after you now with everything under the sun. They have strong evidence that you not only broke the law, but you probably knew what you were doing. They're not going to give you any sympathy here. They're not going to give you any mitigation on a penalty. They're going to nail you as much as they possibly can. When you get a pre-penalty and a penalty notice, give me a call, and we'll begin phase 2 of the case. And this is where it became really frightening for the lawyers. The most frightening thing from a lawyer's perspective is we didn't hear from the client at all. Didn't hear from them at all for 2 years. Nothing happened. I mean, we didn't hear about anything for 2 years, And I got a call. I got a call from an attorney friend of mine in Chicago, and he goes, there's a weird case in front of the Court of International Trade on a penalty. It involved a certain specialty metal from Malaysia land. I'm like, uh-oh, I know what this case is. And it was my case, but we didn't know about it for 2 years. So Customs did its regular job. They sent a pre-penalty notice. Client blew it off. They got a penalty notice. Client blew it off. The Department of Justice says, well, here's your penalty. Here's your bills. Client blew it off. Sureties got involved. Client blew it off. The Department of Justice says, well, to collect on a penalty that there's no opposition to, no one disagrees with it, we'll go to the Court of International Trade. They filed suit in the Court of International Trade against our client, served them with the papers and everything. Client blew it off. Did nothing on the case. So finally, there's a judge, Judge Wallach, to his credit, said, this is just not fair. We got to have a lawyer on this case. And so he calls a friend of mine in Chicago and says, there's a case and we want you to take the case on a pro bono basis. They have no money. They can't afford lawyers. That's why they didn't get a lawyer at all. He looks at the case and he calls me. He goes, this case is pending in the CIT. Your name is all over it. I'm like, yeah, well, there's a reason for that. I handled it earlier. Here's the story. And I told him the whole story of the whole case, and everything else. And he said, well, I offered it. I said, listen, I know I'm not a real CIT litigator that much, but you are. But I know the case really well. I know the client really well. And neither of us can get paid for this. Why don't we just work on this together? A good thing to do. The the lawyer in Chicago went to the judge and said, Larry down in Texas would like to handle this case. Judge
so much for working on it together.
Working on it with me didn't work out quite as much. It was my case entirely, and I turned it down. Actually, I turned it down because I said, I'm not a CIT litigator. I know the case really well, but this is not a case I should really take to the CIT. And the judge's clerk called me up and said, no, we'd like you to take the case. And when a judge says they want you to take the case, you take the case. So we took the case, and we now have the case. I'm meeting with the client again, and we have lunch now, and I'm looking across the table going, what in the world are you thinking here? I told you they were going to come after you. They came after you. The amount of the duties and penalty they assessed was $33 million. $33 million in lost ADCVD, which is a mathematical calculation, as well as the penalty. And of course, the penalty with the maximum penalty you could possibly get. So $33 million. The judge said, we'll give you a year to conduct discovery, and then we'll have our trial. I knew there would not be a trial because we had no case. The government, in a court of law, the government would be able to produce all the evidence that we were able to get by before. It will all come out. I probably had more evidence than they had, but even the evidence they had was bad enough that we were going to lose the trial. So having a trial was not really the option that was there. To spring ahead to the end of the story, because there's a short ending here, eventually the client did lose the case and was awarded on a summary judgment. We didn't even go to trial. We presented the evidence as we had it here. No dispute as to facts here. Judge ordered $33 million in payment by our client. And without going into a whole lot of detail here, I can tell you that our client did not pay a penny. And that's where the real work became the accountants that we hired in the year where we had the case. Our goal was not to win in a court of law. We were not going to win in a court of law. Our goal was to survive the judgment that was inevitable in this case. What can we do here? Settlement with the government was out of hand. They literally laughed. I talked to the U.S. attorney. He goes, yeah, no, we're not going to settle this case here. Your client's dead wrong. They had their chance on the pre-penalty. They didn't do anything here. We're not going to compromise even a single penny. I said, I understand where you're coming from. I understand where you're at on that. Without going into, again, too many details here, I will tell you that the accountants that we had and the other lawyers we had in both a northern state and a southern state about what assets the government could attach. That was a critical part of the decision. What money could be in college funds, what money could be in certain states' retirement funds. Things like polo ponies were not attachable by the government. Some strange things we learned about accounting in those various states that we looked at. But at the end of the day, there was a judgment against our client, which is not undeserved, and they did not pay a single penny of it. So the case as a whole probably lasted about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years. And at the end of that, they did not spend a night in jail. They did not get indicted. They had a judgment against them for a civil penalty which they did not pay. on this. And so that's the end of the story. The moral of the story is this is not a good story for a lesson, in the sense of this is an unbelievably lucky result. So I'll take some credit for good lawyering on the matter, some patience and knowing where to push and not to push. But at the end of the day, this was preventable. What really happened here, the story began long before the search warrant. These people had forward contracts to deliver goods, and they knew the product subject that when they bought it from China going into the Canadian market was subject to anti-dumping going into the U.S. market. They scoured the world looking for an alternative source, and someone from Malaysia land says, "I can do it." And our client, desperate to believe something that would solve a significant financial problem for them, looked the other way when there's probably evidence that this was known. And that's where the story really began. It was not they didn't wake up one day and said, "Yep, today is the day I want to commit a felony." It does not happen that way. They woke up one day and said, "Oh we have millions of dollars of product we've got to deliver, and the amount of duty is 139%. We can't do this. We got to find something else." And so they were desperate to find an alternative, and so desperate, in fact, that they ignored common sense, and they didn't do any due diligence here. You can debate, and certainly the government would debate whether they knew or didn't know. When do they know? There's a fair point that can be discussed on those things here. But it started off like any other business situation here. They faced a bad situation here and made the bad choice. Whether it was intentional or not intentional, it was still a bad choice. And that was the consequence for it. This result was particularly good, but I would caution anyone listening to this is not how these usually work. If the government had, frankly, just done a better job on this, they could have gone to jail.
And Larry, is there an incident that actually triggered this, other than that it was material that it was already classified as anti-dumping, or was it like something that they tripped on and customs said, "Uh-oh, check this out"? You know what I mean? Or is it just the fact that it was that type of material?
I think this case was a combination of two things that are not uncommon here. They trip over something, but they knew where to go to trip. They knew that this product was coming in from Malaysia land, and if it came in from China, it would be subject to anti-dumping. So that they were suspicious. They had no evidence at all of any crime here at all, but they're suspicious that could happen. And that's fair for the government to do that, because people do cheat on this stuff. So the government did look at that. At one point in time, they literally found the bag that arrived in a southern port that said "made in Canada," even though it arrived from Malaysia land and never went through Canada. That's got to ask some questions. Okay. Now they could have asked this now, and at this day and age, they're more likely to give you a C-28 on that. But they believe they really had a criminal case here, and that was that particular fact was not a good fact on that. And they looked into it and realized that, in fact, Malaysia land did not make this stuff. But what really happened here was, and it might have been an innocent mistake, but this product was, in fact, from China. At the end of the day, there was really no doubt about this at all. And any modest amount of due diligence that a lawyer would have done would have caught this. It was not a tricky case. They take it from China in big slabs of metal and broke it into softball size. And under Malaysia land law, that would be a substantial transformation. Okay, irrelevant for U.S. anti-dumping rule. It is certain specialty metal of any size and shape. Okay, importers should have known that it was still subject to AD/CVD, even if you put it into smaller chunks. And that was a mistake here. And sometimes clients don't know that. Certain times where you bring something in, but you did only a modest transformation to it. And a lawyer would tell you pretty quickly, that's not enough. You still have a product. It's not illegal, but it's still product of China. It just took on a little occasional hiatus in Malaysia land. It's still product of China. If you declare a product of China, you pay the duties on the product from China, including the 301 duties, AD/CVD, and everything else here, you're good to go. You'll be broke, but you'll be good to go.
Well, and the other scenario there is that if you're going to source from there and those situations come into play, guess what? If you're trying to get a certain margin of profit for your goods, you're going to have to raise your price. Hence the very objective of what the ADD and CVD type tariffs are for. And then you got the 301s on top of it. It's to cause that as a scenario. But if you're trying to then circumvent that, here's the thing. I guess I look at, if you try and cause and you circumvent it and take actions to do that very thing, now you're running into trouble. But here's where I guess I look at it is, it's okay to look at, are there ways to avoid being taxed or having duty assessed against it? It's okay to look into investigate it. But when you find out a situation where a source is and the duties and taxes are what they are, and then you take steps to create false origin of country of origin reporting or whatever you may be doing, that's where you get into trouble, where you're still trying to get the same source and come out with a different outcome, and then that's, hence you're going to get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, it borrows the concept from tax law. There's case law on this about avoidance versus evasion. It is absolutely okay to talk to an attorney and find the best way to do this, that they can do it legally and soundly, and customs will embrace that. If you'll say, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to send it to Malaysia land, I'm going to do this, I believe this will keep it outside the scope, you get a ruling on that or Department of Commerce clarification on that, and you are good to go. And the government embraces that. They don't care. They understand that you have followed the rules, and if you found a way to make more money because you followed the rules, they don't care. They're not trying to get you. But evasion is when you start making steps to contrary to law. And some of those are just comical. I mean, this case is relatively comical. And the government has all sorts of cases like this. They slap the made in Malaysia land label right over the made in China label. So you can still see it, made in China on the label. We had a client who brought in clothing in the back of the neck. They had the made in Pakistan. But all those labels fell off in the ocean voyage because of the salty air, and all that was left was a bunch of Pakistani labels on the floor and a bunch of Chinese labels on the collar. The government was able to crack that case. It was not difficult. And so you laugh at them, but and sometimes those are people overseas lie, and you're left holding the bag there. And we got case after case like that where there's literally intentional subterfuge, enough to the point where they even give you fake documents, fake everything. They will tell you what tariff number to use because this tariff number is not subject to 301, but this one is. So you got to do your own due diligence here, because I'm not saying everyone overseas lies at all. There's some good folks overseas and good planning, good lawyers overseas that you can work with to get these things done correctly here. But if you do it incorrectly or it's just too good to be true, then you're left holding the bag.
Well, and I guess the net result is that this particular company, the people involved were extremely fortunate about not going to jail. But however, the other scenario there, it sounds like that this particular company wound up going out of business because of
the company was two partners, and we have a whole other discussion about conflicts of interest between the partners, but we cleared that. We represented them both, and so they had the same story on that. One of the first partners, was nearing retirement anyway. And truly, he was a construction guy. He was not the importer behind the whole thing, but he was on some of the entries because his friend, his partner, talked him into doing this. And so, but she was really the one who was more involved with the thing. And the really damaging evidence was probably more hers than anything else here. But I do believe, I do believe even with this, years have gone by now, they just got caught up in something they didn't know what to do. The smarter thing to do, if they had just come to the attorney and said flat out, we are just messed up here. We can't afford 139%. We got contracts. We're going to be sued if we don't deliver that metal. We're going to be sued here. That would have been an easier case than what they did. It had been a horrible case, but embarrassing. They had to admit they were wrong. They might have ended up bankruptcy again, but they would not have gone to jail for that. And that's the other thing too, is sourcing some things out there, and in some of your contracts. This is another key issue here: is there should be some clauses in the contracts, and that's something where I turn to folks like yourself, Larry, that in the event that there's a substantial increase due to international trade or whatever, I know there are clauses to say, hey, look, we're offering this price to you based on our sources as of today. If there's a significant change,
there's a way to come back. Those clauses I know are out there. And, if you have to pull back on your contract without penalty or some kind of minor penalty, punitive penalty between you and your client, then that's a little different than trying to, circumvent this whole process. So
yeah, good contractual drafting is really good. You have a good example of that. Base it on cost plus. We're going to make 15%, give or take a few percent, but not 139%. No one could absorb that here, and you walk away from the contract here. You got to do more than that though, because you may have a good deal because the guy and this is an actual case in Malaysia. You got to know what you're doing if you're the importer of record. We had a case a guy who was bringing in xanthan gum. And the guy over, and this was actually in Malaysia, said, here's the deal. You import it, put it in your warehouse, and pay, and when we sell it, you'll get this percentage. And the guy thought, because he was told to by the Malaysian supplier, you don't pay duty until you sell the goods. Which, of course, is wrong. You pay duty upon the importation. He literally has a warehouse full of xanthan gum and a duty bill that was in the millions of dollars, and he was like an 80-year-old guy who was just dabbling in this thing for fun. And all of a sudden he was clearly a good example of a bad combination of a predator overseas and a victim here who just didn't know better. You got to know better. You got to know better. I mean, even a customs house broker should be able to told him about this, that you pay duty upon importation, not when you sell it. You may not get paid. You may have a contingency relationship where you don't get paid till later, but you still pay the duty up front. And that's an important distinction you didn't know. So.
I was going to say, Larry, I think I hear some kids trick-or-treating at the door, so we may need to go.
It's time to wrap it. Let me do a quick wrap up here. From what I'm getting, all right, as we said, go ahead. If you're going to deal with international trade, it would be wise to have a relationship with a customs attorney firm or international trade firm, whatever, right off the bat. Secondly is do your due diligence, source out your products and all that. And if in doubt, check it out kind of thing. Third would be a scenario that if in the event you get some kind of notice from customs, a 28 or 29 notice or those kinds of things, or any kind of inquiry, not only should you make sure that you are taking steps to respond to that appropriately, but collaborate with your customs attorney firm and don't ignore that kind of stuff. And fourth, when it comes right down to it, if you get served with a subpoena and a search warrant, it sounds like you were saying, you've got to comply if it's signed for and all of that. On the same token, you better immediately then get with your attorneys and figure out and develop your strategy. And it's kind of like you're going to have to open up your kimono with your attorney to say, I don't know, I don't think I've got anything to hide, but let's go through the process.
Well, all good points, Andy. The only thing I'd add to it is when to talk to the attorney, sooner rather than later. If you wait till after the search warrant, I'm not saying it's too late because lawyers can fix things like that as well. But all these things could have been avoided. When you have a legal problem, bring it up early. No problem gets better with time. Like these will fester, get longer, get bigger. This case would have been a unfortunate breach of contract case that might have been embarrassing versus facing life in prison. And there's a time earlier on, any lawyer could have been able to resolve that, to prevent these problems here. And that, if I were to say that was their mistake, that was their mistake. They got to a lawyer, and they got to a lawyer late, but they could have prevented this. And that prevention, I think, is probably the most important lesson.
And proactively look at your contracts and have the appropriate attorneys review it from an international trade perspective, and then obviously your standard legalese. So, all righty. Well, happy Halloween, I guess, folks. And this is one that's like, oh my gosh. Anyway,
I'm going to trick or treating dressed as an attorney. That's to scare everybody. So,
I tell you. Larry, you and I both, all we got to do is show up and we scare folks.
That's for sure. Yeah, you get the cowboy hat. Cowboy hat's better than me going as an attorney. So
there you go.
So.
Thank you,
Larry. Larry. Appreciate it. Lalo.
Good to see you guys.
I guess
right now.
We'll have a good one there for everybody, and take care of yourselves. Bye.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.